Mr. Karthikeyan Nachiyappan. He is an architect who has graduated from the Architectural Association. His research has been published in many esteemed journals, such as the Indian Concrete Journal. He is the founder and director of Studio of Architectural Urbanism, an art and architecture consultancy focusing on research and development of housing projects in Ooty and in Chennai. His research interests include low-cost housing, architectural space making, informality and slums, inequalities in planning, and policies and urban design.
Welcome to UGC lecture series on architecture, unit number 4, lecture number 1. Today we will be looking at why do we need a site selection, how do we locate a site, how does location play a very important role in site selection, and what are the other parameters that we require for a site selection. So, in general, how do we select a site for housing, and along with it we will also look at certain characteristics in the rural as well as the urban context. So, these will explain you the different typologies that prevail in today's society. First, important terminology to define: site analysis. Analysis before you get into the architectural details of a site, or even before you do a building, or so it is the preliminary phases of any housing or any architectural or any urban design process. And it also includes the study of climate factors, geography, historical factors, legal and infrastructural context pertaining to a specific site. So, every site has different characteristics and different context of its own. So, site analysis would vary from site to site, region to region, and of course, country to country. Consideration of physical characteristics to the site. First important characteristic is the selection of a site. Very important. Even before we choose anything, we take a lot of opportunities, we take a lot of choices to select a particular thing. Now, housing as a commodity, when it reaches the target population, the site which is provided for that plays a very important role, and the selection of it takes a much more tedious process. So, the selection of a suitable site is a crucial step in the design of a building or planning a settlement, specifically a housing complex. Location selection. So, the first key parameter we are going to look at is on what basis do we locate a site, or how do we choose it. First important, demographic, which means that the target population. Without them, we are not going to build a site. Any property value would not rise without consideration of the migrants, or any economic balance would not be achieved without the population of it. So, in that case, if we provide a housing complex where you have older people and you try to compensate with them, you might not, or you might have to lose on the younger population. So, there has to be a proper balance between the kind of ages or age profile or demographic profile where a balanced population of both age and income wise is most desirable, and this always leads to the success rate where a market made up of predominantly older residents lacks a younger market to move up and purchase the larger older homes, which means that it lowers the resale price. So, a proper balance of demographic profile has to be created, taking into account or taking into the analytical information of what are the male population, female, age wise segregation. So, all these has to be done as a preliminary study before you locate a site. Migration patterns, of course, from where people migrate, how do they migrate, where do they migrate, and in what they migrate. That is, in search of what do they migrate. So, they especially migration patterns happen within India in search of a job. So, which means that they try to focus on a place where job opportunities are more and where industries are more. When industries are more, you need to provide housing for them. So, you need to locate sites analyzing the migration patterns on which area do they migrate, and housing should be decided based on those parameters. Prevailing land costs and rental value. As you could see metaphorically in this image, a 12-month tour of USA would cost less than staying at home for a year. Rental values have gone so high. The ambition of many marketers or investors are to just boost up the values. But in a country like India, or say a developing country, the rates need not be too high, or people cannot afford it. There is a boom in an industry. There is a new product which is being launched. For anything and everything, land costs go high. More people come in, land costs go high, but what happens to the people? The economic profile is the same. There is no upgradation of their lifestyle, there is no increase in salary. So, when the salary remains the same, but the rental value goes up, what will happen? So, you will have obviously there are certain rules that has to be imposed to control the land costs and rental values, but these are also from a private investor point of view, the prevailing costs and the rental values have also should be taken into consideration in order to choose a particular site. Areas that experience high level of demand for industrial and commercial development drive up the land prices. So, this is one key parameter. A reasonable mix of market rate and social facilities will generally mean reasonable rates and that are desirable. So, every housing complex should always have a balance of social and communal facilities which will cut down the market prices or make it more reasonable and desirable for the users like us. It is a competitive environment. People everywhere are running behind now in search of houses especially, and there are a lot of developers that have boomed up in the past decade. So, which means that neither void or saturated with independent living facilities would work. Both the conditions may adversely affect what a housing situation is, what the rental value is. So, there again has to be a proper balance between the provision of facilities within an environment, so that the rental values could be probably mitigated based on those factors, and that also creates rental rates that are more acceptable by population. Now, moving on to site selection, this is another. So, the minor difference between location selection and site selection is that location is on a larger scale. You have those parameters to get a location for what you call as site selection. So, site is a much smaller part which is embedded in the location you select, where you just provide a space for housing or say a different functional amenity. Now, how do we select a site? The selection of site will be based on creating a social environment. There are a lot of interactions that has to be taken care of, and this interaction should be facilitated by the site you select. There has to be a proper mix of different ages, different cultures, different people, different outlooks, different economic conditions, different work mixes, so that people interact with each other. So, when this interaction happens, a site sustains, and this sustainability creates a better opportunity for that site to thrive for a longer year. Next is size and density. You cannot build a house, say if you take a 1 or 2 acre development, and you cannot build 10,000 houses or 10,000 units in it, or provided you give 5 or 6 acre site and build 10 buildings in it. Both does not work in a country like us. So, the size or the area of your particular site and the density that is required based on the migration patterns and the population of that particular area, both has to go hand in hand in order to provide efficient site size and efficient density, so that the target population are also considered of while the provision of houses. Otherwise, this creates a chaotic environment or overcrowded situation that leads to congestion. Next, topography. A floodplain, probably along a river, along a water body, along a road, more accessible sites, good topographical conditions, good water facilities. So, all these natural factors and topography play a very important role in creating an aesthetic development of a site. A flat site, a wetland, a contour land, all these creates different typologies of housings that would make a site more interesting. So, the topographical part of a site should also be taken care of in order to provide good aesthetic value to your development. Planning, more importantly, the major stage where you suggest how to plan your development. The first important character is vistas. What are your site neighbors? What are your surroundings, and how much you can view from your site? Say for example, you would have heard developers saying that there is a nice lake view from the house, there is a nice beach view from your house, there is a nice garden view from your house. So, these are vistas which are taken into consideration, which gives you a proper, sufficient, reasonable rate of selecting that particular from a user point of view. Accessibility to social and civic facilities. Any person who is going to buy a piece of land or say a parcel of land or say a 1 or 2 BHK apartment, they will definitely look into few social and civic facilities that are available in a walkable distance with them. So, availability of post offices, availability of ATMs, banks, dispensaries, clinics, all these have to be taken care of when you locate a site in a particular location. So, when all these facilities are available to a particular user, he would close his eyes to buy whatever you suggest. Important part is proximity to retail, hospitals and healthcare. So, the previous one and this works together. If things of these social and civic facilities are available to a user within a mile radius. You can walk and access it. So, this is more important in a development. Putting things in an accessible way, or say creating an environment that is more accessible through walk. Walking environments or walking neighborhoods prove to be more efficient than motorable neighborhoods, and things should be available close to each other. Surrounding housing profiles always influence what your site character is. You cannot create an icon in a housing neighborhood compared to the others. So, which means that you might have to study the morphology of the existing environment even before you plan. So, once you locate a neighborhood, you locate your site, and once you plan certain parameters based on vistas, your housing development should relate to the harmonious environment that is created. So, you are going to key in your design or your development in a particular urban context. So, everything has to go hand in hand with the development you do. So, the morphology has to be identified, studied, surveyed, and your profile should match the morphology. In a single key or a graphical representation, your place, that is your development, surrounded by key attributes which are nothing but the uses, activities, sociability, access, linkages, comfort and image. So, these when further elaborated into intangibles like user and activities includes fun, special, useful. Sociability includes how much cultural and social interaction you have or the users have within your living environment. Access and linkages, that is the proximity of different social facilities, and the comfort, the physical comfort one person feels in the housing development. So, when these intangible connects with these different key attributes and the measurements that are taken care of, a housing development would prove to be successful. Lastly, climatic factors. This is an architectural attribute to a planning, where even before you start your building, you would analyze what are the climatic factors, so that you propose a building or you propose a development based on summer sun, winter sun, sun angles, shading, raining. You orient your building to maximize wind directions, you orient your site in order to have efficient rainwater harvesting, you orient your topography, the morphology looks similar in order to maximize energy efficient buildings. So, all these climatic factors have to be also taken into consideration even before the planning or the execution of a building. Now, moving on to housing design. So, here we look at different physical housing typologies. There are innumerable typologies that have been designed in every city. Every one of us would tend to say our own house is an individual typology, but to classify everything under one roof, so we have few different things. So, the generalized categories are freestanding detached dwellings and attached multi-user dwellings. So, within these categories, we look at different typologies that come under each of them. First, single detached housing means it is a single house, probably a villa. There is one plot of land and there is one house or one dwelling, that is one family lives within that unit. So, that is called a single detached housing. It is a development consisting of building and only one dwelling, which is separate from any other. Attached dwelling house. This is almost similar to row house category, where the vertical levels accommodate one dwelling, but horizontal levels, that is through the row you have different housing units that might be harmonious or monotonous in nature. So, attached dwelling house means a dwelling which is attached to any other dwelling or a building, but which does not have another dwelling above it or below it. So, it has an individual car park space and it has an individual lawn of its own. Multi-dwelling house means a number of dwellings attached in a single. So, you have a single plot, you have a dual occupancy apartment. So, the minor difference is that the core or the staircase is within, and you have 2 or 3 different units within one single plot of land. So, it has common areas, and the development can be strata tidal and can include common areas and common infrastructure within, but in the exterior it looks as a single. Residential apartment building. So, here another minor difference is that there could be a purchaser who could enjoy the housing unit, or the purchaser could rent it out to a tenant, or it could also be leased to a family. So, apartment building has common facilities, it is compounded and it is also 2 or 3 story high, where there is a multi occupancy rate within one same building. Social housing, otherwise called as affordable housing. In 1920s, London, or say the slums of London, were shattered, and these were the first proposed units by the London County Council. So, this is provided usually by a public authority or the housing development boards of a particular city. The key function of a social housing is to provide accommodation that is affordable and accessible to all. So, this can be a mix of typologies like row house, or it can be a multi-user dwelling. So, every individual house has its own entry and it is prevailed at a low cost. Housing cooperative, it is a legal entity usually held by a corporation where there are different shareholders who invest on that. So, every shareholder is granted an access to the housing unit inside it, which means that the resources from them are used, and it consists of one or more residential buildings. It is a type of housing tenure which is different from other types of housing units, which is nothing but where in a single row house or an attached unit the occupancy could be single and it could be rented or leased out, but here the tenure is completely different and it is one single building where multiple housing units could be attached. Shop house, interesting category where you have mercantile in the ground floor and you have things above it. So, it is a house with a shop below in simple terms. It is an architectural building typology which is vernacular to Southeast Asian region. You could find in around Japan and China, where you have the mercantiles running around in the that forms the promenade of the street or the facade, and above you will have houses where people dwell, probably the same owners of the shop, or it could be rented out. Now, classification of typologies. So, now we are looking at different typologies that prevail in our Indian context. So, we can classify it as rural and urban. In rural, we have public and traditional, and in urban we have public and private. Public is nothing but it is given by the municipal authorities or the state government under different schemes. Traditional is vernacular typology and private is, as you could see, estates, independent flats, squatters, and public in urban areas would be the slum clearance, sites and services, mostly the low income or the housing provided by the central government or state government through schemes in order to promote a safe environment for the low income and the economically weaker section. And the traditional house is mud, agriculturalist house, potters, weavers, agraharam, chettinad and toda. Rural housing, as you could see in the image, a single monotonous housing that is being replicated into different sites and plots. Everything is the same. You have a staircase access to the terrace, but the most important or negative impact of all these buildings is that these are not designed to taken into consideration the social and economic conditions of that target person. So, when this is not taken into consideration, what remains is this, meaning housing just remains as housing, which has a negative impact on the society as well as a negative impact on that environment. This is not being cherished. So, the person who tends to live in this probably might rent it out. So, the value of it might change and there is no good aesthetic value that is also attributed to it. In contrast to it, you could see a mud house which is thatched above, you could see a small plinth, you could see a small house where the functional spaces are arranged around a central hearth. The above house is being built by the government and the below house is being built by an individual user. The cultural conditions, social conditions, economic conditions are not taken care of, everything is taken care of here. Even though the house is simple, it has an architectural and aesthetic value to it. More importantly, the functional aspects of every user who build this own house is being taken care in the spatial plan of it. The above houses are planned and the below houses are planned taking into consideration all these factors. An agriculturalist, potter's or a weaver's house, you could see the much modern or a contemporary way of representing. So, what was before a thinnai, that is a sociable part of the house, has now become a sale part of view. So, which means that it generates a revenue, it generates micro economy, which means that these spaces that are built by the users itself occupy a lot of flexibility in it, which means that one space could be put into use after a couple of years and in turn it changes. But the previous house which you saw built by the government is not flexible for any users. Buildings built by them have common shared spaces where the women folk entertain themselves in terms of having a communal gathering close around the well. So, wells form the backyard of the house, which also plays a social gathering, and there are few couple of children who play in and around those spaces, and a well is being shared. So, this is a common or a social amenity that brings in people together from different houses. So, 4 or 5 houses share a common part, which is these gathering spaces. More importantly, handicrafts play a very important role in rural housing typologies. Every people follow the shop house, which means that every people work there and live there. So, for working there, they need to identify spaces which are comfortable for them to work in. So, the anthropometry of every space would be changing according to the profession. A weaver's house will have a space to accommodate the weaving machine or the hand looming, or a handicraft person or a person working with pottery will have an outdoor or a backyard space where he could store his clay pots, or there is a private working space for the clays to be molded together. So, all these has to be taken care by a public housing authority which decides to provide housing for the rural areas. Another interesting typology is an agraharam. As you could see, it is a typology where you have road in the central, and the end of the axis you could see a temple at the corner and surrounded by houses on either sides, and all the houses are more linear in character, and of course, the streets are a bit narrow which end up in an axial temple. The above image represents a plan of one of the segments or one of a neighborhood in Kallakurichi in Tamil Nadu, where you have one particular road and you have few narrow parcels of land which abut the road on either streets. All of it form a linear geometry. So, one could question, if there is a wall to wall construction and if these walls are so narrow, how could the light come in? The answer is very simple. The planning of this agraharam takes into consideration 1, 2, 3 or a couple or a series of courtyards, the open spaces which you could see on the roof slabs, which pulls in light, which means that the courtyard sizes may vary in terms of size, in terms of scale and in terms of hierarchy, and the uses might also vary. So, the etymology of the spaces are as follows, where you have a grand stairway or the Puram Thinnai or the main Thinnai where social gathering happens, and as you move on from Puram Thinnai, you move into Agam Thinnai, or you have a small safety room which is locked and which is being accessed from either sides. Then you move into probable courtyard or the relief, which is the space surrounded by the courtyard for functional uses. Talam and Adukala, where it is another hierarchy of courtyard. Probably these two courtyards host the main function of the houses, or any special occasion would be held there. Moving on to the next space, which would be the service part, where you will have the puja room, you will have the kitchen, you will have the well, probably the store room, and finally that leads you into the communal space, or you have the toilet and a backyard space which will have another well. So, these series of courtyards play a very important role in also ensuring adequate supply of light and air inside the building. So, ventilation is solved, functionally spaces are arranged one according to each other, and every space gives another attribute to the remaining spaces. So, when these form a settlement, you could see a monotonous arrangement of all these spaces. So, this further enriches the character of any settlement, even though it is monotonous in nature, but every elevation or street facade of every user will change. So, this in turn creates an harmonious environment. So, even this cannot be planned in a modern context. So, these are vernacular typologies which dictate you what are the role of individual people who play in the organizing a particular settlement. Moving on to Chettinad House, an important typology which is exhibited or which has exhibited the grandeur in one of the important parts of South India. So, it is otherwise called as Natakotai Nagaratar's house, which means that these people are from Pumbugar, where they fled because of a flood and they had settled in parts of Sivaganga district. So, now the image dictates you how grandeur should be the house. Usually the houses are 1:2, 1:3 or 1:4 in ratio, where you could see the palatial attributes in an elevation like this. So, the topmost part you could see are the attributes that are taken into consideration, the religious aspects. The balustrades, the arched windows, and these are from the colonial influence, and the compound wall always restricts people from entry. So, there is also history which tells that if this was a deity, which means that the family followed a religious practice, or if this was Britisher, this family was influenced through colonialism. So, this is a palace or this is a palatial house which exhibits a contrast from religious attributes of architectural characters along with the colonial characters. This space of the house is called as Mogappu. As the image shows the grandeur, a double height space with granite columns that are flanked on either sides. The entire plan is symmetrical in nature. You could see Italian marble flooring, you could see side colonnades that are flanked, and you could also see a grand chandelier that opens it up. this is the front part of the house where the entire investors or say business people would sit and chat. This is the next part of the house, once a sketch illustrating a place of resting for the menfolk, and the side play, the plinth which is raised above the ground is nothing called as the Kanakapillai room, where people used to check notes or check accounts of what has been sold and what has been purchased. The sketch is being attributed, so where the columns form a granite and teak wood part of it. So, the grandeur is also not based on what the architectural elements are, but also the materials. An Italian marble floor, Indian granite and Burmese teak wood all play a regional contrast, but work or go hand in hand with each other. The major part of the house, which is called as the Valava Vasal, which is nothing but the central courtyard where the religious or the special occasions happen. And interestingly, the house was planned based on two important functions. One was exchange of business and second was weddings. So, this important place plays a very important role where the wedding ceremonies happen, and additional advantages of this space is that you have an open courtyard which is surrounded or which is open on top, which is also efficient in terms of sucking the air out of the space to provide or ensure adequate supply of light. The verandas or the eaves that project out of the corner prevent rain from getting inside or the rain water to get inside, and the pots, the bigger pots that are kept over here are important aspects in terms of collecting rainwater. So, in modern days we call it as rainwater harvesting. During rains, this entire arrangement of seating spaces will move inside. So, again rural typology suggests how flexible spaces were planned. Even though it is for one particular functional use, it has been moved or made into different typologies of uses. In other words, we could call it as these spaces need not be mentioned by a length, width or height, which means it has a fourth dimension, which is also called the social character of every space. The amount of sociability existed in these kinds of rural environments, though the typology might be small like a potter's, weaver's or an agriculturist house, or it might be as grand as a palace like this, but the social character remains the scale, but the hierarchy of it varies and the grandeur of it varies because of the economic conditions of individual user. The planometric form, which tells you the entire floor area, which is rectilinear in shape, which extends from one road to another road. So, is in the ratio of 1:2 or 1:3 sometimes. You basically have the street over here, from it you enter and you have two flanking corners. You enter through a small thinai, you move into a space. So, the space before your major courtyard, the central courtyard, is the Mudalkattu, which means that the area which is built before or after the first courtyard. So, the space which is built first after the courtyard. The space behind it is the space for the women folk. So, again culturally people are being biased in terms of creating a social barrier. So, the space beyond the courtyard on towards your right is the men folk space, and the space on this would be the women folk space. So, both of it exchange in terms of ceremonial occasions in the central courtyard. When you move to the back, you have the backyard which will have the toilet, utility and other facilities along with the kitchen. Now, another important component of this is entire house is symmetrically the same. So, when you bisect the entire house along a particular axis, both of it remain the same. So, the last part of this is cluster housing. Cluster means getting together things, as verbally it says. So, now in a housing cluster, which means that you are providing a shared atmosphere for different housing typologies. As conceptual image explains, different houses arranged along a central courtyard, or that central courtyard is nothing but a common facility. So, the important aspects of it is it has a powerful physical form for urban design, especially when you target different densities and different communities. Clustering concept helps you in doing a lot of things. It is related in size, it creates harmony, it creates a well balanced environment, and it also provides equality to the housing users. And about cluster housing, we will be looking at a concept of Belapo housing designed by Charles Correa in our further chapters, and it also is a means of access, territorialities, it creates a border within itself, and finally it also protects users from climatic conditions, especially rainfalls. So, to summarize the contents today, so we had been looking at different planning factors and physical characteristics based on migration patterns, density, accessibility, proximity, land costs and environments. And on the other side, we were also looking at different housing typologies, from rural vernacular typologies to urban housing typologies, from a row house to chettinad house. So, this provides you a spectrum of different typologies and also gives you a clarity about how do we select a site for a particular housing complex. Few questions to be kept in mind. So, briefly the characteristics of that influence the selection of a site. The planning and climatic factors could be taken care of. Differentiate the detached and the multi-user dwelling units and other typologies of units. You could also have a peek on what vernacular housing typologies are, and you could also explore in detail in the Indian context and different states. Explain the appropriate sketches, the planning, climate and cultural factors that have shaped up the housing typologies and also the urban housing typologies. So, we will further look on into chapters in the forthcoming sessions. Thank you.